All right, so some of you may remember this, but back in the early 2000s, the government of Uganda was fighting this internal war with the Lord's Resistance Army, also known as the LRA. And if you don't remember, the LRA was this rebel group that was located in northern Uganda, and they were gaining this fierce reputation of just being really brutal. In fact, if you looked at how their ranks were able to grow, it wasn't because people were won over to their cause. It was because if you didn't join them, well, they would murder you and your family. And so one day in northern Uganda, there was a woman named Margaret who was tending her garden with a number of other friends just outside of their village when a group of child soldiers, boy soldiers, entered their garden with machetes, and the adult commanding officer ordered their executions. And so they were hacked to death with machetes, all with the exception of Margaret. Because she was 6 months pregnant, well, basically the commander thought it would be bad luck to kill a pregnant woman, but she did not leave unscathed. Instead, he ordered that her lips and her ears and her nose be cut off. And so somehow she was able to survive this attack and was eventually able to give birth to a beautiful boy named James. And they were taken to the World Vision Child of War Center, where they didn't just receive the physical treatment that was needed for the attack, but also the emotional and some spiritual counseling. If you're not familiar with World Vision, wonderful Christian organization, and so you know that at the center, they were going to share with her the good news of Jesus. And when they shared the good news of Jesus, it resonated with her heart and her soul, and she gave her life to Christ. But part of the gospel message is not just receiving forgiveness, it's also extending forgiveness. And so as she's wrestling through, what does that mean for my attackers, she just wasn't willing to go there. I mean, for her, there was still all kinds of rage, anger, and she wanted them to die. For the past 4 weeks, we have been in a series called Heart Disease and How to Break Free, specifically how to break free from this heart disease of anger. And if you've been with us in the series, you know that one of the things that anger screams and shouts is, "You owe me, you owe me." It's that whole concept that anytime you have these enemies of your heart, whether it's guilt, whether it's anger, whether it's envy, whether it is greed, there's always going to be this imbalance of debt. And so anger, that imbalance comes when you start looking at the people around you and saying, well, you owe me. And maybe it's for the small offenses of life, like you owe me better behavior. And so because you're not giving me the behavior that I want, well, I'm annoyed and frustrated with you. Or it could be those bigger issues in life, like we see with Margaret. I mean, something was clearly stolen from her, something was taken from her, and it would be very natural for her to have a thought of, you owe me. You owe me my ears. You owe me my lips. You've taken them physically from me, and that has left me scarred for life. But we've all been there, haven't we? Maybe it's not the big ones, but we've all been there. Maybe it started when you were younger. Maybe you had a group of friends that you hung out with during recess, and you hung out and played and always had fun, and there was all kinds of laughter. But one day was different. The laughter was not something that you were a part of. Instead, the laughter was at your expense. Like your close friends started teasing and making fun of you, and you didn't really know what to do with that, but you knew it hurt. And so you did what you thought would be right. You went to the teacher because the teacher was going to settle this, going to make things right. But the teacher looked at you and said, you know what? You need to stop being so sensitive. Go play. You had something taken from you that day, right? You had a sense of your self-worth taken from your friends. You had a sense of justice taken from you when your teacher didn't do what your teacher was supposed to do. Or maybe it was later in your teen years. Maybe you were dating somebody who just was always pushing, and then eventually took something you weren't really willing to give, and you didn't have language for it at the time, but looking back at it, yeah, it felt like a theft. Something was taken from you. Maybe it's every single day you go to work. Some of you go into work and you experience theft because you work really hard and you expect to be encouraged, but you don't receive encouragement, you receive correction, you receive criticism, and it's as though you're just surrounded by pickpockets who just seem to be taking like $1 at a time from your back pocket every single time a critical comment is made. And you're screaming and you're shouting, you owe me. You owe me something different than this. I think we've all been there from time to time, and this hurt this rejection, oftentimes just things not going the way we want them to go, can make us feel a little victimized. I think we can oftentimes step into life and on our work situation, and we can just feel like victims. But there's a problem with that, because when you're a victim, you have this built-in excuse not to change. You have this built-in excuse not to actually experience the transformative work that Christ wants to do in your life, because really the problem isn't you. The problem is out there. There's a problem out there. It's him. It's her. If this situation was different, if she didn't say that, if he didn't do this, there's a built-in excuse for any bad behavior that you have in your life. In fact, I don't know if you've ever found yourself in the victim mindset. I know I certainly have, and I've definitely observed it in other people. And when I have seen it in my life and I have observed it in other people, what do we typically see those people spending their time and their energy on? Is it becoming the people that Christ wants them to be, or do they spend their time and energy focused on how that person owes them? Right? They focus their time and energy on, you owe me. I'm not getting what I want, and until you give me what I want, I'm going to be angry and I'm going to be upset. Let me ask you, let's say you go to the doctor's tomorrow, and the doctor runs a series of tests, and at the end of the test says, all right, I'm sorry to tell you this, but you have some heart disease. Like, there's some clogged arteries, there's some hardening of the walls here. You've got some heart disease. In that moment, how are you going to respond? Are you going to respond by saying, well, doctor, this is just who I am? Like, the hardened arteries, that's just a part of who I am. This is how God made me. Like, who are you to tell me that I have heart disease, that this is a problem? Is that how you're going to respond? I hope not. Are you going to immediately point the finger at the food industry? Man, if they weren't making all these delicious snacks with all the high, fat content, I wouldn't have this issue, right? Probably not. Are you going to point your finger at your parents? It's mom and dad. It's grandma and grandpa. It's great grandma and grandpa. They passed on these genes to me, and if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't have this heart disease. Is that how you'd respond? Is that how you'd react? My guess is you'd probably lean into the doctor who says, hey, you got some heart disease, and you'd say, doctor, what do I need to do to get well? What do I need to do to get well? And this is where we're headed today. If you don't mind, go ahead and turn to John chapter 5. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the gospel writer John, in his gospel, there are only 2 recorded healing miracles that take place in the city of Jerusalem. Only 2. There may have been more, but he only records 2, which is kind of interesting, because when you think about the importance of Jerusalem as this hub for all things Jewish spirituality and the economic powerhouse that it was in those days, and even when it comes to the political influence, I mean, really only 2 healing miracles? So what we're going to do is we're going to examine these 2 healing miracles, because not only is it just a fascinating study in how Jesus has the power to heal, but on top of that, I think it's going to give us insight into how we can receive healing as well. So we're going to be, again, in John chapter 5. I'm going to start reading in verse 1. It says, sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there is in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, a pool, which is in Aramaic called Bethesda, which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here, a great number of disabled people used to lie: the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. Now, depending on your Bible translation, you may or may not have a verse 4. How many of you guys have a verse 4? Okay, I'm going to assume the rest of you do not have a verse 4, and that probably means you have a modern translation of the Bible, because most modern translations do not have a verse 4, which some of you are like, wait, what? I feel like I'm cheated. It should have a verse 4. Where's the verse 4 at? Well, what happened was we now have, the reason why most modern translations don't have verse 4 is we have access to much older and much more reliable transcripts of the Bible. And the oldest and most reliable transcripts of the Bible, verse 4 doesn't exist. It doesn't show up until about 500 years after the most reliable transcript. And because it doesn't have it, most people was like, well, this probably was an add-on. Like, how did that happen though? How did it just get added in? Well, as the Bible was being copied and recopied and recopied and recopied by hand, which is quite painstaking, the scribes would oftentimes make little notations on the margins Kind of like if you have a commentary Bible, there's all kinds of notations at the bottom, or maybe footnotes, and you're like, hey, what's that? And you read the little notes. Well, they would go ahead and do that on the margins of what they were copying in. But once one scribe wrote it on the side, maybe the next scribe would actually include it into the verses themselves. Now, we don't know if that's exactly what happened here, but it's quite possible that that's what happened. So what was the notation? What was the explanation of what was going on? There was the belief, there was the understanding, or at least at the very least, a superstition that at this pool of Bethesda, an angel periodically would come down and stir the water. And when the angel would stir the pool of water, the first person to go into the water would receive a healing miracle. And this is one of the reasons why they think that so many blind, lame, and paralyzed people were hanging out by this pool. They were waiting for a healing. So let's go and start reading in verse 5. It says, one who was there had been an invalid for 48 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, do you want to get well? He asked the question, hey, you want to get well? Which the obvious answer is what? Yes! I mean, almost 40 years. The obvious answer is yes, of course I want to get well. This isn't necessarily his response, though. You know, this is Jesus, the great physician, who has the ability to not only know what he needs, but also knows how to provide for that need. And he doesn't necessarily just say yes. What does he say instead? Verse 7, Sir, the invalid replied, I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I am trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me. See what's happening there? He's preoccupied with what other people are or are not doing. Instead of actually focusing on the fact that, okay, Jesus is someone who can provide me my greatest need, I'm so caught up with what they're doing or they're not doing. You ever been there before? Like, I don't think any of you have been paralyzed before. If you have, it doesn't look like that's still the condition. But I think all of us, we find ourselves paralyzed at times. I think we find ourselves unable to move forward relationally with people because of things that they've done. I think there are times where we fail to move forward emotionally because of baggage in our past. I think there's times where we even fail to move forward spiritually. All the while, who's in front of us, trying to communicate to us over and over again, hey, I've got the healing that you need. It's Jesus, just like here. But what do we do? What do we do? We say, okay, well, God, I will move forward the way you want me to move forward once they do what they're supposed to do. Like, once they respond the way they're supposed to respond, once I get my apology, then I'll move forward relationally with that person. Once they admit that I'm right, I'll move forward. Once they admit that they were wrong, once I get what I deserve, I will go ahead and move forward. This is where this man seems to be, at least when it comes to being preoccupied with what others are supposed to be doing. Does Jesus seem to care about this? Not even a little bit. I mean, he's just going to launch right into what he needs to share with this person. And I think this is what he needs to do with so many of us. He knows what you need. He knows that he can provide it. And so he says, okay, guys, if you want to move forward and actually eliminate and remove heart disease from your life, this is what we talked about last week. What do you need to do? You need to forgive. You need to cancel debt. Stop worrying about what so-and-so is doing and what so-and-so isn't doing. Focus on me and start canceling the debts around you. And I think maybe if you were here last week, you heard this message of this wonderful master who cancels a $9.6 billion debt. And we encourage you guys, in order to move forward and actually forgive, what do? We focus less on the $15,000 debt that is owed to us, and we start focusing once again on the $9 billion debt that God has canceled in our life. That's what we need to do. We need to start focusing more on that. And maybe you were so convicted last week, maybe there were some people that you started forgiving. You started at least going through the motions of forgiveness. But it's been my experience that some people, what they do is they'll say, okay, I'm going to forgive that person. And as the week goes on, they'll do one of these things. Fold their arms, start tapping their foot, and I forgave him. But he still needs to get his act together. Right? Okay, because you are so amazing, Jesus, I'm going to forgive her. But she still needs to do what she knows she needs to do. Like, everybody knows she still needs to do that, so I'm still going to wait on her to do what she needs to do. Right? You ever do that? Like, you said you forgave, but then all of a sudden you start folding your arms. You start tapping your toe and you say, I'm still waiting. I'm still waiting for them to do what they are supposed to do. I think when we find ourselves doing this, what are we doing? We're deciding that it's better off for us just to lay on the mat. Like, it's better off just to hang out and lay on the mat, even though Jesus is saying, you want healing? Are you wanting to get well? Well, then what do you need to do? Notice what he says for this man to do. I think it's the exact, if he was here having a conversation with us, I think he would look so many of us in the eye and say, hey, do you want to get well? Here's what you need to do. Verse 8, Jesus said to him, get up, pick up your mat and walk. At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. Maybe some of you need to get serious about conquering this dragon of anger in your life. It begins by getting up and saying, it doesn't matter what so-and-so is doing. It doesn't matter what this situation is. I'm going to walk with Jesus in this. All right, the second healing miracle that we see in the Gospel of John actually comes in chapter 9. So if you want to turn some pages over to chapter 9, we're gonna read about a healing miracle of a blind man. And what's interesting is in this chapter, this healing, we don't get really any insight into what is in the mind and the thought of the blind man, but we do get an insight into how the disciples are viewing this situation. In fact, what they specifically ask Jesus is, okay, who's at fault? Like, there has to be somebody we can blame. Like, this guy's blind, so who's at fault? Was he involved in some sort of sin, and so that's how he got the punishment? Like, he's the one that's at fault, huh? Or is it mom and dad? Like, were mom and dad doing something sinister? And so, well, because mom and dad are so evil, that they're the ones to blame, and that's why this man's blind. Like, someone has to pay, right? Jesus says, you're missing it completely. Verse 3, he says, neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus. But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Let me ask you guys, and I'd love to see a show of hands. I know some of you just hate raising your hands, but if this resonates with you, don't be ashamed, just raise your hand. But if it doesn't, don't raise your hand. How many of you genuinely want to see the work of God working through and in you, in and through your life? You want to see the work of God in and through your life. What's required here? We're going to see this 4-step approach that's required. What does Jesus begin doing? This is weird. We're not even going to read it. I'm just going to explain it to you. So Jesus actually, he's having this conversation with the disciples, and then he starts spitting in the dirt. Already kind of weird. It's like, was that a normal thing that Jesus did? He was just like, I got some loogies, I got to get my... Like, was that normal? I don't think so. He probably just started spitting in the dirt. He makes a little bit of a mud paste with this, and then he wipes a bit of this loogie mud onto this blind man's eyelids. And he says, go wash in the pool of Siloam. And I'm not sure if the blind man was just eager to get this stuff off his eyelids or he was just eager for a healing, but that's exactly what he does. He goes to the pool of Siloam, he washes his eyes, and what is he going to do? He has sight. Do you see the sequence, though, that's required for this healing to take place? So Jesus gives instructions. This blind man obeys. Jesus heals. And then he's able to move forward with his life. Because this is the same approach that needs to happen for us to experience healing. Jesus is giving us instructions. Are we going to be obedient? Are we going to get up off our mats? Are we going to actually clean the mud off of our eyes, experience his healing, and finding a new way to walk and move forward? See, this is what we see in these miracles. Notice that the first one teaches us a new way to walk. And this second miracle teaches us a new way to see. But it only happens when we live out obedience to Christ. And what has Christ been teaching us? The past 4 weeks we've been looking at it. We have to be willing to cancel debt. We have to be willing to begin forgiving the people around us. And so I want to get really practical with you. And this is one of the reasons why I was so eager to get the announcement insert into all of your hands. If you did not get in the door with the announcement insert, Brad's in the back. He's willing to pass those out to you, because on the back of the announcement insert, we've got notes for you, and then we're going to engage in an exercise. The notes are for you to hopefully remember what we need to do in order to forgive. Go ahead and just raise your hand if you need one of those notes, by the way. And then the exercise we're going to hopefully participate in a little bit later. But if you already have it, great. You can find a pen, hopefully not too far from you, in one of the chairs in front of you. But there are 4 steps that we need to take if we're going to actually live out forgiveness. And the first one is to identify who you're angry with. Okay? Take some time, maybe even right now, start thinking about some people that you're angry with. For some of you, this might be really easy. You're just angry with your kids. Like, they gave you a really hard time this morning. You're like, yeah, brats, right? In fact, I think I hear my youngest making some noises right now. I don't think my wife's angry with him, though. But maybe your kids, he's possibly. Others of you need to go back further than this. And I would encourage you, even right now in this space, think about how far you need to go back. Like, how far do you need to go back? How much anger are you processing today that maybe happened, like, it feels like a generation ago, but it still comes up every once in a while? Go back as far as you need to go and start making a list, maybe even on paper right now. Just, who are you angry with? If you're sitting next to somebody that you're angry with and you don't want them to see like their name on your piece of paper, maybe you can make a mental list, right? Just start making a mental list of people that you're angry with. And if you're thinking that this is a silly exercise, it's not, because forgiveness is more than just deciding to move on. Like, we think we can just move on, but these things have a way of just kind of percolating back up in our hearts. There's a difference between moving on and actually truly canceling debt, forgiving. Remember, that was our definition last week. What forgiveness is? Forgiveness is canceled debt. And so trying to forget and not actually canceling debt typically leaves us in a worse spot. And so here are some questions just to generate some thought when it comes to maybe people that you need to put on your list. Who are you angry with? Okay, who do you hope to never see again? Got anybody in your life that you just never want to see again? Chances are that person may need to be on your list. Let me ask you this. Who do you find yourself having imaginary conversations with? Conversations that you always win? Like, you've got the perfect argument this time. Not the first time, but this time, like in your head, you're just letting them have it. That person might need to be on your list. Who would you like to actually get revenge on if you knew you could get away with it and no one would think bad about it, right? They didn't know it was coming from you, but you would love it. That'd be awesome. Let me ask you another question. Who do you secretly desire to see fail? Like, if someone came to you with some juicy gossip today and they're like, guess what, so-and-so totally failed. I mean, that would be like sweet dessert. Give me a spoon, I want to eat more, tell me more. How really, bankruptcy, right? Who is it? Who is it on your list, right? That person probably needs to be forgiven. Is it a family member? Is it a friend, ex-boyfriend, ex-girlfriend? Is it an ex-wife, an ex-husband? Maybe it's a deceased parent, a coach, a boss. Who needs to be on your list? You know, this whole exercise, these 4 steps that I'm giving you, I think they're easy to ignore. In fact, knowing how we typically engage the application of a sermon, I think it might be one of those things that a lot of you won't actually participate in this. You just leave and think, maybe I'll get to it. And you won't. I just want you to understand, if Jesus is here and he's saying, do you want to get well? It starts by actually following his instructions. And this is what he instructs us to do. We need to focus in on not just feeling good about ourselves, but actually sometimes going to the darker parts of our past and saying, okay, yeah, 20 years ago, I didn't think it was a big deal, maybe now, but I probably need to actually cancel some debt there. Because if we decide that we're not going to do this, again, we're just deciding to lay on our mat. We're deciding to keep the mud on our eyelids. And just like it would be absurd for us to read the story and say, wait, Jesus was right in front of your face and you weren't willing to be obedient to actually experience this healing that he's wanted to offer you, it's absurd for us to sit in this room and say, yeah, I'm not going to extend forgiveness. I'm not going to go through these steps. I'm not going to go through these exercises. It's up to you, but I just want to challenge and encourage you to do it. Okay, step 2. Step 2 is determine what they owe you. Determine what they owe you. I think you probably know and remember with pretty good precision what they did, but what do they owe you? I mean, they may have been horrible, but what do they owe you? You know, maybe it's, again, going back to that whole experience on the playground. Like, you were hurt. You felt this sense of loss, but what do they owe you? Is it trust? Like, was trust lost that day? What do they owe you? What does that teacher owe you? Do they owe you justice? Like, think through, what do they owe you? You know, what would be required if they were going to, if everything was going to be right in the relationship, if finally there was going to be balance between you and that person, what would they have to give you? What would they have to provide for you in order to create that balance? Let me give you a few ideas. Maybe it's as simple as an apology. Do they owe you just an apology? Is it money? Did they take money? Did they take time? Did they take a family, a job, a relationship, an opportunity, a promotion, a chapter of your life, recognition, appreciation? Maybe it was just kindness. They just owe you some kindness. You can't cancel a debt, guys. You cannot cancel a debt unless you know what's owed you. Go back to last week with our parable that Jesus shared. If you weren't here with us last week, maybe go back because you're like, I don't know what you're talking about. Jesus told this wonderful parable of this master who forgives a servant who owes this tremendous amount of money, but he knows exactly what his servant was owed. Like, his servant owed him 10,000 bags of gold, or 10,000 talents, the equivalent of over $9 billion today. He knew exactly what it was. So he was able to forgive. He was able to cancel that debt perfectly because he knew exactly what needed to go. So what do the people in your life owe you? Step 3, cancel the debt. Cancel the debt. This one's the obvious one. We just cancel the debt. And some of you are like, yeah, that sounds really wonderful, but how do you do this? You know, this means deciding that that person doesn't owe you anything anymore. How do you cancel the debt? You actually make this conscious choice, they don't owe me anything. It's not easy. It's quite difficult, but it is an act of your will. Based on God's forgiveness of you, you have an act of will to say, okay, just like Christ forgave me, I am canceling this debt. That person owes me nothing. Nothing. I'm not waiting on them to do something. I cancel the debt. You know, oftentimes in our lives, you know, we're waiting. We're doing the whole folding arm thing. But this whole idea of canceling debt can really have all kinds of different strategies. I know of one guy who he put 2 chairs up in a room. And he didn't want anyone around, so he made sure the house was empty. And he put 1 chair here and he put 1 chair here. He sat in this chair and he had a conversation with his stepfather. Stepfather who he had grown to hate. A stepfather that he had grown to just have all kinds of hurt and anger towards. And he had a conversation where he just unloaded all of the pain. He unloaded all of the thefts that took place. And at the end, he said, all right, Dad, you don't owe me anything anymore. You're forgiven. And he got up out of the chair and he walked out of that room with a new way of walking, new way of moving forward, a new way of viewing that relationship. And yes, there were times where some of that emotion came popping back up again. You know, he would remind himself every single time. It's like, nope. I remember back in that room, I canceled the debt. I don't have to pick this thing back up again. It's canceled. I know other people who will write a letter to the people who owe them. And they'll write this letter as detailed as they want, and at the end, they'll actually burn it as a symbolic reminder to say, nope, they don't owe me anything anymore. That debt is canceled. One of the things that I get asked from time to time is it appropriate? Is it helpful? Should I go to the person who owes me and tell them that I've forgiven them, that I've canceled their debt? Now, you may be able to find scripture to support that move, but personally, I would say I don't think it's necessary. In fact, even as you look at these healing miracles of Jesus, they took place between Jesus and that individual, right? No one else needed to be involved. for that healing to take place. And I think the same is true when it comes to you forgiving someone from your heart. There is an exception to that, though. If that person comes to you recognizing that they have wronged you and they ask for forgiveness, if you are in Christ and you have experienced Christ's forgiveness, you absolutely have a responsibility to forgive that person. If they come to you at some point and just say, you know what, I made a huge mistake, should you communicate that you've forgiven them? Absolutely, 100%. Other than that, I think sometimes it does more damage than good. Sometimes the people that have wounded and actually taken from us, they don't even realize they've created a theft in our hearts. And when you bring it to their attention, they're actually put on the defensive, and it may make the relationship even more tense. Number 4. Fourth step is to dismiss the case. It's actually choosing to dismiss the case. So here's why this one's so important. Going back to how our emotions don't always catch up with our decisions, emotionally, you might find yourself reopening the case. You ever been there? You're just like going through life. You're just jogging one day, you're just shopping one day, and then you rewound the tape and you're reliving that hurt, you're reliving that theft, you're reliving that pain once again. You're like, I thought I forgave that person. Why am I feeling this? And again, some of us, what do we do? Right then in that moment, we reopen the case and we have all the conversations like, I hate them. Now I'm waiting for them to do something. Or we just try to distract ourselves. We try to ignore it. I would encourage you, there's a better way. And I think the better way is actually in that moment, it's okay to have those feelings. I think it's okay maybe even to relive the hurt and the wound. But after you're done reliving the wound and the hurt, you need to remind yourself, just like that example of the man who says, no, I remember that day. I remember that day that I actually canceled the debt. You need to remind yourself that you've canceled the debt as well. Do not believe the lie that the debt hasn't been canceled. Well, how do I know how do I know I've really forgiven? Because you chose to. It was an act of your will. And so when you just have those emotions, just remember, okay, feelings come and go. But I'm going to go ahead and make the same decision. I've canceled that debt. I began this message by talking about Margaret and her story. Margaret, who was physically harmed, removed, or her lips, her ears, her nose removed by these child soldiers. So she's at the World Vision Child of War Center, and she's receiving all this wonderful therapy and all this wonderful counseling. And one day, to her horror, she actually sees the very man, the commanding officer who ordered her maiming, enter that place. And she's just horrified. She's filled with fear, and there's a sense of anger and a sense of, I want this man to die. What happened was he was captured, and he was brought to the same center so that he could experience the therapy. He could experience the healing that he needed to have. And so they began to work with him, and they began to work with her. And as they had this conversation with him, he first just completely denied that he had anything to do with this atrocity. But eventually, over time, he actually confessed to the crime. And they continued to work with Margaret, and they continued to work with both of them until one day they actually had a meeting together. And at this meeting, this man, with as much remorse in his heart as he could show and demonstrate, he asked for Margaret's forgiveness. Now, in this moment, if you were Margaret, could you cancel the debt? Could you forgive? Well, this is exactly what Margaret does. She seizes the same forgiveness and love and grace that she had been given by Jesus, and she canceled this man's debt. And I don't know about you, but when I hear stories like that, it certainly convicts me, because I'm still just so petty looking at those $15,000 debts. Meanwhile, what has God done in our hearts and our minds, in our lives, in our souls? I mean, he's forgiven us such a bigger debt. And when we see other examples of women like Margaret, I mean, doesn't it just encourage you to do the same? That's how we'll experience our healing. If you have your notes, I want to go ahead and encourage you to bring those out. Go ahead and go to the next slide, John. We're going to do an exercise together. It's one thing to talk about healing. It's another thing to actually experience it. And so this is the space in our service where we're just giving the Holy Spirit some time to do a work in our hearts. I'm going to walk you through what I would encourage all of you to do in just a moment. But this is an act of a choice that you can make or not make. But notice that there's statements and then there's some things to fill in. So I'm just going to explain this. It starts out, Heavenly Father, blank has taken blank from me. This is where you put the name of the person that you know you need to forgive. They've created some sort of theft in your life. Place their name there. And then name whatever theft it was. I have held on to this debt long enough. I choose to cancel this debt. Blank, that person's name again, doesn't owe me anymore. Just as you forgave me, I forgive, and then you include their name once again. This may take a little bit of time. Maybe you're not willing to do that this morning, but I would encourage you to take it home. However, we're going to play a song. It's not the band. We wanted the band to be able to participate in this exercise as well, but it's just a lyric video. There's not a whole lot on the screen to watch, and so this is more of allowing the song maybe to wash over your heart. But when you're ready, during this song, if you've filled this out, what I would encourage you to do, symbolically, bring it to the cross. And if you're willing to cancel these debts and really remove the heart disease in your life, just leave it right here at the foot of the cross and you can return to your seat. And not only do I want this to be a healing moment for you, but I want this maybe to even prepare your heart to receive once again God's healing grace as we take communion. And so this is going to kind of act as a lead-in even to communion, but I'll be up in just a moment to read some scripture. Let's go ahead and listen to the song and you have a time with God.